I always considered myself an average man. My name is David, a 38-year-old IT consultant, the kind who blends into a crowd without much notice. My life has been predictable, almost painfully so. I live in a modest suburban house with my wife, Emily. We don't have kids, a conscious decision we made early on, thinking it would allow us more freedom to pursue our careers and personal interests. For the most part, it worked. Emily is a teacher. She works at a local high school, and if there is one word to describe her, it would be graceful. She has this effortless way about her, the kind that makes people stop and admire. We met through mutual friends, a simple, unremarkable introduction that slowly turned into something deeper. Before I knew it, we were married. For years, I thought we were happy, or at least content. But lately, things have felt off. At first, I thought it was just the usual wear and tear of being together for almost a decade. We had our routines, our comfortable silences, and those moments when we sat in the same room, completely engrossed in our separate worlds. It never bothered me before, but now it gnaws at me like a slow-growing itch. There were small things at first, a change in her perfume, a sudden interest in evening walks, or her phone always being set to silent. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was being paranoid. After all, we both had demanding jobs. Emily often brought work home with her, grading papers late into the night. I figured she was just tired, distracted. I tried to be understanding, even suggesting we take a short vacation to reconnect. She agreed, but there was a hesitation in her smile that I hadn't noticed before. Then, I met my friend. A chance encounter that should have been insignificant, but instead became the beginning of the end. Mark, an old college buddy of mine, was back in town for a few days. We grabbed a drink at the local pub, reminiscing about the old days and catching up on each other's lives. He knew Emily, of course, but not well. We were talking about our respective marriages when he mentioned something that made my ears prick up. "You know," he said, "I think I saw your wife at that new jewelry store downtown a few weeks ago. She was looking at this beautiful pendant. I thought it was odd, because she was with some guy I didn't recognize." I laughed it off at first, saying Emily had been into jewelry lately, but Mark's words stayed with me. I tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding or a harmless coincidence. Yet, when I got home, I found myself staring at Emily a little longer, noticing things I hadn't before, like how she seemed to be hiding something, her smile a bit too forced, her laughs coming a fraction too late. One evening, after she returned from her usual walk, I saw her wearing a new necklace, a pendant I had never seen before. It was delicate, silver, with a small emerald at its center. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off casually. "Oh, this? Just something I picked up on sale," she said, but there was a hint of discomfort in her voice, a slight pause before she spoke. I let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, after another conversation with Mark, that everything fell into place. The pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, and a cold dread settled in my chest. Then came that evening, the moment I couldn't ignore anymore. I saw the pendant again, the same one Mark had described. She walked in, her smile a little too bright, her demeanor too carefree. I felt my heart drop. Unable to hold it in any longer, I confronted her. And that's when everything began to unravel. I remember my hands were trembling as I pointed to the necklace around her neck. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice more aggressive than I intended. Emily froze, her eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. She tried to mask it, quickly averting her gaze, but I could see the panic setting in. "It's just a gift," she murmured, her voice trailing off into nothing. "Don't make too much of it." "A gift from who?" I pressed, feeling a tight knot forming in my stomach. There was a moment, just a flicker, where I saw the truth in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, then quickly closed it, like she was weighing her options. She finally let out a nervous laugh, as if trying to play it off as a joke. But I knew better. I could feel it. The shift in the air between us, the unspoken words hovering like a dark cloud. "Just a friend," she said finally, but her voice was shaky. "You're being ridiculous, David. Why are you so worked up over a stupid necklace?" I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But the way she kept glancing away, the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, something inside me snapped. I took a step closer, my eyes boring into hers, searching for a hint of truth in the sea of lies. "What friend, Emily?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Who gave you this?" She flinched at my tone, and for a moment I thought she might tell me. But then her face hardened. Her expression changed from one of guilt to one of defiance, her jaw tightening. She squared her shoulders and folded her arms across her chest, a gesture I had seen 1,000 times before when she felt cornered. "Does it matter?" she shot back, a sudden edge in her voice. "It's just a gift, David. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" I felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely think straight. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. I knew that something was horribly, horribly wrong. "Because it matters to me," I replied, my voice breaking a little. "I want to know who gave you this necklace, Emily. Just tell me. Please." For a second, I thought I saw her resolve falter, but then she turned away from me, heading towards the kitchen as if the conversation was over, as if she could just walk away from this and everything would be fine. I grabbed her arm, stopping her. She spun around, and there it was, a flash of anger, of frustration, something dark that I hadn't seen before. "Let go of me, David," she hissed. "You're being ridiculous." I held her gaze, feeling the heat rising in my chest, my grip tightening despite myself. "I'm not letting this go, Emily, not until you tell me the truth." She wrenched her arm free, stepping back, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between confession and defiance. Finally, she let out a bitter sigh, shaking her head. "Fine," she said, almost spitting the word out. "You want the truth? It's from a man I've been seeing. Happy now?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt my knees go weak, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I just stared at her, trying to process what she had just said, trying to understand how this had happened. "Who?" I croaked, my throat dry, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" she repeated. But there was no more anger, no more defiance, just a cold, stark resignation. I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was falling into a dark, endless void. The room was spinning, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, 1,000 thoughts, but all I could do was stand there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, the woman who had just shattered my world with a few simple words. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, like my body had been locked into place by the sheer force of her confession. Seconds? Minutes? It all blurred together into a haze of disbelief and fury. My mind struggled to catch up, to make sense of the reality unfolding in front of me. Emily didn't move. She didn't try to explain herself or even look guilty. She just stood there, her arms still folded, as if bracing herself for whatever would come next. Her face was a mask, calm, almost indifferent, but her eyes were betraying her, a mixture of fear and defiance swirling in their depths. "You've been seeing someone?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice a mix of incredulity and hurt. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I was speaking them for someone else, in some alternate version of my life. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to us, not to me. "Yes," she said simply, as if stating a fact like the weather. Her tone was flat, emotionless, like she had detached herself from the situation, removed herself from the reality of the confession she'd just made. "Who?" I demanded again, louder this time, my anger beginning to bubble over, spilling out in hot, sharp bursts. Who is he, Emily? She hesitated for a moment, biting her lip, and for a second, I thought she might refuse to answer. But then she sighed, running a hand through her hair, and looked away. His name is Jake, she muttered, almost under her breath, as if saying his name out loud would make this even more real. Jake who? I pressed, my mind racing through all the names I knew, trying to find a connection, a clue. Jake Sullivan, she said louder now, her gaze meeting mine with a new fierceness, as if daring me to react. He's someone I met a few months ago, at a conference. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. At a conference? I repeated, the words tumbling out of my mouth before I could stop them. Is that what you do at conferences now, Emily? Pick up men? She flinched just slightly, but recovered quickly. It wasn't like that, she snapped, her voice suddenly defensive. It just happened. It just happened? I laughed bitterly, feeling a wave of nausea roll over me. That's it? That's your excuse? Her face softened a little, the anger fading, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. David, I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't plan for this. I shook my head, a sharp, angry gesture, as if trying to clear the fog from my mind. How long? I asked, my voice low and strained, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. How long have you been seeing him? Emily swallowed, and I could see her throat working, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. A few months, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. A few months, I echoed, my voice rising with each word. So while I was here, thinking everything was fine, you were out there, what? Sneaking around with him, meeting up in secret? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said it all. I felt a rush of white-hot anger flood through me, my vision blurring at the edges. Did you sleep with him? I asked, my voice barely a whisper now, as if I was afraid of the answer. Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking away from mine again. Yes, she said finally, almost too quietly to hear. Yes, I did. And there it was. The final nail in the coffin. The confirmation I had been dreading, the words that would forever change everything. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, all the air sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping, struggling to breathe. I turned away from her, running my hands through my hair, feeling the weight of the betrayal pressing down on my shoulders like a physical force. How could you, Emily? I whispered, my voice breaking. How could you do this to us? She took a step toward me, reaching out with one hand, but I pulled back, recoiling from her touch as if it burned. David, Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare try to justify this. Don't you dare. She flinched again, and for the first time, I saw tears forming in her eyes, her calm facade beginning to crack. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. But it was too late. The damage was done. The betrayal had already ripped through my heart like a jagged blade, leaving nothing but pain and anger in its wake. And as I stood there, staring at the woman I had once loved with everything I had, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The room felt smaller now, suffocatingly so, like the walls were closing in around us. My chest was tight, my breaths coming out in ragged, uneven gasps. I could see Emily standing there, tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing but a cold emptiness inside me. I needed space, needed to get away from her, from this, from the crushing weight of what she had just admitted. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. I heard her call out behind me, her voice cracking with desperation. David, please, can we just talk about this? I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, I knew only rage would come pouring out, a torrent of anger and hurt that I wasn't ready to unleash. I grabbed my jacket from the hallway, fumbling with the door handle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. I stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling the cold breeze against my face, a welcome contrast to the heat burning inside my chest. I needed to clear my head, to think. I walked quickly down the street, not really caring where I was going, just needing to move, to put some distance between myself and the house that suddenly felt like a prison. I wandered aimlessly for what felt like hours, my mind racing, replaying every moment, every conversation, every smile she had given me over the past few months. Had it all been a lie? Had I been so blind, so naive, to not see what was right in front of me? Eventually, I found myself at a park, the one where Emily and I used to come when we first moved into the neighborhood. We would sit on a bench under the large oak tree, talking for hours about our dreams, our plans for the future. I stared at that bench now, feeling a fresh wave of bitterness wash over me. I sank down onto the cold metal, burying my face in my hands. My mind was a mess of thoughts, questions swirling around like a storm. How long had she been unhappy? Why hadn't I noticed the signs? Was it my fault? Did I drive her to this? Then another thought struck me, sharp and cutting. Who the hell was Jake Sullivan? A man she met at a conference, she said. That wasn't much to go on, but I had a feeling he was more than just some stranger. No, this was someone who had wormed his way into her life, someone who had found the cracks in our marriage and pried them open. I fished my phone out of my pocket and dialed Mark's number. He answered after a few rings, his voice groggy. I'd forgotten how late it was. David? What's up, man? Mark, I began, my voice tight and strained. You said you saw Emily with someone a few weeks ago at that jewelry store. Was his name Jake? Jake Sullivan? There was a pause, and I could hear Mark's hesitation on the other end. Yeah. I think that's what she called him. Why? What's going on? I felt a fresh surge of anger and humiliation. It was true then. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. She'd been out in public with him, walking around like they were a couple, like I didn't even exist. She admitted it, I said through gritted teeth. She's been seeing him, sleeping with him. Mark swore softly. Jesus, David, I'm sorry. I didn't think it was something serious. I thought maybe it was just a friend. A friend? I laughed bitterly. No, Mark, not just a friend. This guy's been screwing my wife. There was another long pause, and I could hear Mark struggling to find the right words. Do you know what you're going to do? I don't know, I admitted. I don't know anything right now. I needed to hear it from someone else. I needed to know I wasn't going crazy. Mark sighed. Look, David, if you need anything, I'm here. Whatever you need, okay? Yeah, I muttered, not really hearing him. Thanks. I hung up and stared at the phone, my hand clenching it so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I felt a numbness creeping over me, a sense of disbelief that this was really happening, that this was my life now. I thought back to the moment when I first saw that damn pendant, the innocent question that had led me down this path. I could see it clearly in my mind. Emily's face when I confronted her, the way she had hesitated, the panic in her eyes. She knew. She knew I was on to her, and she still tried to lie. I sat there on that cold bench for a long time, lost in thought, trying to figure out my next move. How do you even begin to pick up the pieces after something like this? How do you face someone who has ripped your heart out and still find a way to move forward? I didn't have any answers. But I knew one thing. I couldn't just go back and pretend like nothing had happened. I couldn't let her betrayal slide. I had to know more. About her, about Jake, about everything that had been hidden from me. And I would start by finding out exactly who this man was who had taken my wife. I stayed out for hours, wandering the streets with no destination in mind. The darkness of the night seemed to swallow me whole, mirroring the confusion and anger that churned inside me. The cool air did nothing to calm the storm raging in my chest. Every thought seemed to circle back to the same point: Emily and Jake. The name alone was like a thorn in my side. I knew I had to confront him, but how? When I finally returned home, it was well past midnight. The house was eerily silent, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. I stepped inside, my shoes scraping softly against the hardwood floor. The lights were dimmed, the kitchen empty. Emily wasn't there. I felt a brief flicker of panic before I heard a soft noise coming from upstairs. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy from crying. For a moment, a surge of pity shot through me, but I pushed it away. She looked up as I entered, her eyes meeting mine, and I could see the torment in her gaze. But it didn't matter. Not now. "David," she began, her voice raw, like she had been screaming or crying for hours. "I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you, but—" I raised a hand, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it," I said coldly. "Not right now. I've been thinking, and I need some answers. Real ones this time." She nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "Okay," she whispered. "Ask me anything." I felt my jaw clench as I sat down on the chair by the window, keeping some distance between us. "How did it start?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "How did you meet him?" Emily swallowed hard, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "It was at a conference," she said again, her voice barely audible. "One of those professional development things for teachers. He was one of the guest speakers." "And?" I prompted, my eyes narrowing as I watched her. "What? He gave a good speech, and you decided to have sex with him?" She flinched at my harsh words, but didn't look away. "No, it wasn't like that," she said, her voice quivering. We talked after his presentation. He was charming, funny. I don't know, David, it just happened. We met for coffee a few times, then lunch, and one thing led to another. I could feel my teeth grinding together. "So, this wasn't just a one-time thing," I said slowly, feeling the rage building again. "This was a relationship." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes," she admitted, her voice cracking. "It was... I don't know anymore." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. "How many times?" I asked, my voice low, almost a growl. "How many times did you sleep with him?" Emily's face crumpled, and she seemed to shrink into herself. "I don't know. Maybe 5 or 6 times," she whispered, the words coming out in a rush. "I didn't mean for it to happen, David. I swear, I didn't." I felt a sickening twist in my gut. "And you kept it going," I spat, "all while coming home to me, to our house, our life. Did you ever feel guilty? Did you ever feel anything?" "Yes!" she cried out, her voice suddenly louder, more desperate. "Every single time. I felt horrible. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. I was caught up in it, in the excitement, the attention. I don't know how to explain it." I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of the woman I used to know, but all I saw was a stranger who had taken my life and turned it upside down. "What does he mean to you, Emily?" I asked softly, the anger in my voice now tempered with something else, something closer to despair. "Do you love him?" She hesitated, and in that split second I felt my heart break all over again. She was considering her answer, weighing it, and that hurt more than anything else. Finally, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "No, I don't love him. But I don't know how I feel anymore. I'm so confused, David. I'm so lost. Lost. Confused. The words echoed in my mind, and I felt my hands trembling again. You're lost? I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You think you're lost, Emily? What about me? What about what you've done to me? Tears streamed down her face now, and she covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing quietly. I know, she whispered through her tears. I know, and I'm so sorry. I stood up, unable to look at her any longer. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said flatly. Sorry doesn't change anything. You've torn us apart, Emily. And for what? Some cheap thrill? Some new adventure? She shook her head, sobbing harder. I don't know. I don't know why I did it. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm going to find out who this Jake Sullivan is, I said quietly. I'm going to find out everything about him, and then we'll see where we go from there. Emily looked up, panic flashing in her eyes. David, please, don't do anything rash. Don't tell me what to do, I snapped, turning away. You lost that right when you chose him over us. I left the room without another word, my mind made up. If she thought I was just going to let this go, she was dead wrong. I needed answers, and I was going to get them, no matter what it took. I spent the rest of the night in the guest bedroom, but I didn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. Emily and Jake, in some faceless hotel room, wrapped in each other's arms. The images tore at my insides, each one more painful than the last. I knew I had to do something, anything, to reclaim a sense of control, to feel like I wasn't just another casualty in their little game. By dawn, I had a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was something. I got up, got dressed, and left the house without a word. Emily was still asleep, or at least she was pretending to be. I didn't care. I needed to find Jake, to look him in the eyes, and to demand some kind of explanation. Maybe then I could start to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. I started with the basics. I knew he was a speaker at a conference for educators, which gave me a place to begin. A few phone calls later, I found out he was based in the city, working for some non-profit organization that focused on educational development. I dug deeper, using every tool at my disposal, social media, public records, anything I could find. It didn't take long to put together a picture of him. Jake Sullivan was in his early 40s, with a polished, confident smile that practically leaped off his online profiles. He was the kind of guy who radiated charm, a former teacher turned consultant, with a long list of accolades and a perfect family man persona. His website was filled with photos of him at various events, shaking hands, giving speeches, always surrounded by admiring crowds. I could see why Emily might have been drawn to him. He had that aura of someone who knew how to make people feel special, like they were the only person in the room. But there was something else, too. Something beneath the surface. His eyes. In every photo, there was a hint of something guarded, something that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I had to confront him. I had to see this man face to face, to understand how he had managed to seduce my wife and blow apart my life. I finally found an address for his office, a small building downtown. I drove there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The city was bustling with life, people moving in all directions, but I felt detached, like I was watching it all from a distance. None of it mattered, not anymore. When I arrived, I parked across the street, taking a moment to steady myself. I could feel my heart pounding, my pulse racing with a mix of anxiety and anger. I had no idea what I was going to say, what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I had to see this through. I stepped out of the car and walked across the street, my eyes fixed on the small plaque beside the door that read, Sullivan Educational Consulting. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I pushed the door open and walked inside. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile, clearly used to greeting visitors. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Jake Sullivan," I replied, my voice surprisingly calm. "Is he available?" She hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering just slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, but it's important. Personal." Her eyes narrowed just a bit, but she nodded. "Let me see if he's free," she said, picking up the phone and pressing a few buttons. She spoke quietly into the receiver, then hung up and looked back at me. "Mr. Sullivan will see you now. His office is down the hall, last door on the left." I nodded and thanked her, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination as I made my way down the hall. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. I reached his door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," a voice called from the other side. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jake Sullivan was sitting behind a sleek modern desk, his face lit up in a practiced, welcoming smile. He stood up as I entered, extending a hand. "Hi there," he said warmly. "Jake Sullivan. How can I help you today?" I ignored his hand, my eyes narrowing as I took in his appearance. He was just like his photos, clean-cut, fit, with that easy, self-assured confidence. But now, up close, I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the slight twitch in his smile. He looked at me with a curious expression, clearly wondering who I was and why I was there. "You don't know me," I said, my voice low and steady. "But I think you know my wife, Emily." His smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Emily?" he repeated, trying to sound innocent, but I could hear the hint of nervousness in his voice. "I've met a lot of people named Emily." "Emily Collins," I said sharply, cutting through his act. "The woman you've been screwing behind my back." His expression changed instantly, his smile vanishing as his eyes hardened. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sat back down slowly, steepling his fingers together as he studied me. "I see," he said calmly. "You must be David." The way he said my name, with that slight edge of condescension, made my blood boil. I took a step closer, my hands balled into fists at my sides. "How long?" I demanded. "How long have you been sleeping with my wife?" He didn't flinch. "Look, David," he said, his tone annoyingly calm. "I understand you're upset." "Upset?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You've been screwing my wife, and you think I'm just upset?" Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or impatience. "It's not as simple as that," he said quietly. "Emily. She's a wonderful woman. I didn't mean for this to happen." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "No? Then what did you mean for Jake? To ruin my marriage? To destroy my life?" He held my gaze, unblinking. "It wasn't about you," he said slowly. "It was never about you, David. Emily. She came to me. She was the one who reached out, who wanted more. I just gave her what she needed." His words felt like a slap in the face. "What she needed?" I echoed, my voice dripping with disdain. "And what the hell would you know about what she needed?" He leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "More than you, apparently," he replied softly. I felt a blinding surge of rage, and before I knew what I was doing, I lunged at him, my hands grabbing the front of his shirt. "You son of a bitch," I growled, my face inches from his, my breath hot with fury. "You think you can just take what's mine and get away with it?" Jake didn't struggle. He just stared back at me, his eyes cold, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Maybe you should ask her why, David," he whispered. "Why she chose me." His words cut deeper than any punch I could throw, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if he was right. I shoved him away, my chest heaving, hands trembling with a mixture of rage and frustration. Jake stumbled back but quickly straightened himself, his eyes never leaving mine. That cold smile of his lingered, like he was enjoying this, like he was getting some sick pleasure out of watching me come undone. "Go to hell!" I spat, feeling the bile rise in my throat. I turned away, heading for the door, but his voice stopped me in my tracks. "You're asking the wrong questions, David," he called after me. "The question isn't why she chose me, the question is why. She felt she had to." I froze, my hand on the doorknob, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. I didn't want to turn back, didn't want to give him the satisfaction, but I couldn't help myself. I turned slowly, my face flushed with anger and confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" I snapped. Jake crossed his arms, leaning casually against his desk as if he owned the place. "You think this is just about SX?" he said, his voice calm, almost condescending. "You think she just wanted a thrill, a little excitement on the side?" I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "Isn't that exactly what it was?" I shot back. "Some midlife crisis bullshit? Some cheap fling?" He shook his head, chuckling softly, and it took everything in me not to walk back over and punch him square in the jaw. "No, David," he replied. "That's what you want to believe. That makes it easier for you, doesn't it? Easier to blame her, to blame me, without asking yourself the real question. What was missing? What was she looking for that you weren't giving her?" My heart pounded harder with every word he spoke, each one hitting like a hammer to my chest. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he didn't know a damn thing about me or Emily or our marriage, but there was a small, insidious part of me that wondered if he was right. "You think you know her?" I growled, my voice trembling. "You think a few months of sneaking around makes you some kind of expert on my wife?" Jake sighed, his expression softening, like he almost pitied me. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know she was unhappy, David. I know she felt alone. Alone." The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sting of it. "We've been married for 10 years, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We had a good life. I gave her everything she ever wanted." Jake nodded, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes now, a look that almost made me want to punch him even more. "Maybe that's what you think," he said quietly. "But did you ever ask her what she wanted? Really ask her?" I felt a knot form in my stomach, a familiar sinking feeling I couldn't quite shake. I had always assumed Emily was happy, that we were fine. Sure, things had gotten a little stale, a little routine, but that was normal, wasn't it? That was marriage. "You're full of shit," I muttered, turning back toward the door. "You don't know anything." He didn't stop me this time. He just watched me with those damn eyes of his, a hint of a smile still playing at his lips. "Think about it, David," he called after me as I walked out. "Think about what you've lost, and why." I slammed the door behind me, feeling a rush of anger so intense it made my vision blur. I stormed out of the building, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. I needed to get away from there, needed to clear my head, but Jake's words kept replaying in my mind, over and over, like a broken record. Was he right? Had I missed something? Had I taken Emily for granted all these years, assuming she was content, assuming she was happy just because I was? I shook my head, trying to dispel the doubts creeping in, but they only grew louder. I got in my car and drove, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that place, that man. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The city streets blurred past me, a swirl of lights and shadows, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was Emily, about our life together, about everything that had led to this moment. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of the city, near the old pier where Emily and I used to go when we first moved here. It had been years since we'd come back, years since we'd sat on those wooden benches and watched the waves roll in, talking about everything and nothing. I parked the car and got out, the cool sea breeze hitting my face, bringing with it the faint scent of salt and seaweed. I walked over to the water's edge, staring out at the dark, churning waves. I thought about what Jake had said, about Emily feeling alone, feeling lost. I hated him for saying it, for making me doubt everything I thought I knew, but I hated myself even more for not being able to dismiss it outright. I thought back to the past year, to the nights I'd come home late from work, too tired to talk, too distracted to notice if something was wrong. The weekends I'd spent on my laptop, catching up on emails, while Emily sat quietly on the couch, reading a book or watching TV. The times she'd suggested we do something different, take a trip, and I'd brushed her off, saying I was too busy, that we could do it another time. Was that it? Had I missed the signs? Had I pushed her away without even realizing it? I felt a wave of shame wash over me, mingling with the anger and the hurt, creating a toxic cocktail of emotions I didn't know how to handle. I had spent so much time being angry at her, at Jake, but maybe I needed to look at myself too. Maybe there was more to this than I wanted to admit. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the water, letting the cool wind whip through my hair, trying to calm the storm inside me. I didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go from here. But I knew one thing. I needed to talk to Emily. Not to accuse her, not to fight, but to understand. I needed to know why. And I needed to know if there was anything left worth fighting for. By the time I got home, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the front yard. I sat in the car for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that buzzed just beneath my skin. My heart was racing, my palms were sweaty, and I could feel that familiar anger creeping back in. But I forced it down. This wasn't about rage anymore. This was about answers. I stepped out of the car and walked up the front steps, my footsteps heavy against the wood. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, almost too still, and I wondered if Emily was even there. As I opened the front door, I heard movement from the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale, eyes red, and swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of relief and fear. "You're back," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I nodded, closing the door behind me. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "We need to talk, Emily. Really talk." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and gestured to the seat across from her. I sat down, feeling the weight of the moment settle over us like a heavy fog. I could see she was scared, that she was bracing herself for another round of accusations, another battle. But I had spent the past few hours thinking, replaying everything Jake had said, and I knew I needed a different approach. "Emily," I began slowly, my voice softer than before. "I need to know why. I need to understand what happened. Why did you feel like you had to turn to him? What was missing?" She looked at me, surprised by the lack of anger in my tone. Her lower lip trembled, and I saw her eyes fill with tears again. I don't know," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I wish I had a simple answer, David, but I don't." I nodded, keeping my gaze steady, willing her to open up. "Was it me?" I asked quietly. "Was I not enough?" She shook her head quickly, but I could see the pain in her eyes, the struggle to find the right words. "It wasn't you," she said softly. "Not exactly. It was us. I don't know when it started, but I began feeling invisible, like I was just another part of the furniture, like you saw right through me." Her words hit me hard, sharper than any knife. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," I whispered. I thought, I thought we were fine. Emily nodded, a sad smile tugging at her lips. I know, she replied, but I didn't. I felt lonely, David. Even when you were right next to me, I felt like I was on my own. I tried to talk to you, tried to tell you, but it always seemed like you had something else on your mind. Work, emails, meetings, everything but us. A pang of guilt stabbed at my chest. She was right. I had been so caught up in my career, in building a life for us, that I had forgotten the very reason I was doing it all in the first place. I had assumed she was okay because I was. I had missed the signs, ignored the little moments when she reached out and I hadn't noticed. I'm sorry, I said, the words thick in my throat. I didn't realize. I didn't know. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. I know you didn't, she whispered. And that's why it happened. I met Jake at that conference and he listened to me. He saw me. He made me feel alive again. My stomach twisted at the mention of his name, but I forced myself to stay calm. And now? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Do you still feel that way? About him? Emily hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. I could see the conflict in her expression, the battle raging inside her. I don't know, she admitted finally, her voice small. I don't know what I feel anymore. Everything is such a mess. I'm so confused. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. Do you want this? I asked, gesturing between us. Do you still want us? She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, David, she whispered. I don't know if we can fix this, if we can go back to how things were. I felt a lump in my throat, a wave of despair washing over me. I don't want to go back, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. I want to go forward. I want to understand where we went wrong and see if we can find a way to make it right. She wiped her tears, her breath hitching as she tried to compose herself. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared that even if we try, it won't be enough, that we're too broken. I leaned forward, reaching out to take her hand. She hesitated for a moment, but then allowed me to hold it. Her skin was cold, her fingers trembling in mine. I'm scared too, I confessed, but I'm willing to try, Emily. I'm willing to fight for us, if you are. She squeezed my hand, her eyes searching mine, looking for something. Hope, maybe, or reassurance. I didn't know if I could give her that, didn't know if I had it in me. But I knew I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Okay, she whispered finally, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. Okay, David. I'll try. I'll try for us. A small flicker of relief sparked in my chest, but it was fragile, like a candle in a storm. I knew this wasn't a resolution, wasn't a fix. It was just a step, a small, tentative step toward something uncertain. But it was a step nonetheless. As I sat there, holding her hand, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. There were no guarantees, no promises, just a long road full of broken pieces that we'd have to pick up one by one. But for the first time in days, I felt a sliver of something other than anger and despair. I felt the faintest hint of hope. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Emily and I walked around each other like we were stepping over broken glass, afraid that one wrong move would shatter whatever fragile piece we had managed to find. I had never felt more exhausted, not from lack of sleep, though there was plenty of that, but from the sheer weight of carrying all those emotions. We agreed to go to counseling, something I never thought we'd need. I didn't know if it would help, but we had to try. The therapist's office was a small, cozy room with dim lighting and soft chairs, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside me. We sat across from each other, Emily's hand gripping mine, but her grip felt tentative, unsure, like she was still deciding if this was what she truly wanted. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with a calm, soothing voice, asked us to talk about what had happened, to lay it all out in the open. At first, it was awkward, painful. Emily spoke first, explaining how she had felt lost, how she had drifted away from me without realizing it, how Jake had filled a void she hadn't known was there. I hated hearing his name again, hated the way it seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud, but I stayed quiet, listening, trying to understand. When it was my turn, I talked about how blindsided I felt, how I had taken her for granted, assuming everything was fine just because I wasn't paying attention. I admitted my own faults, my own failures. I could see the tears in her eyes, the regret on her face, and it struck me how much we had both hurt each other without even knowing it. The therapist asked us to talk about what we wanted now, what we needed from each other moving forward. Emily said she needed to feel seen, to feel like she mattered, like she wasn't just an afterthought in my life. I told her I needed honesty, openness. I needed to know she was truly committed to fixing what was broken. The sessions were hard, draining. Each one peeled back another layer, revealing wounds we didn't even know were there. But slowly, painfully, I felt something begin to shift. We began to talk more at home, really talk, about things we hadn't touched in years. I found myself noticing things I'd ignored before, the way she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled when she was excited. She began to open up more, sharing her fears, her hopes. But the shadow of Jake still loomed over us. I couldn't help but wonder if she still thought about him, still missed him. One night, as we sat in the living room, I finally asked her, "Do you still think about him?" I asked quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you still miss him?" Emily looked up, startled by the question, but she didn't look away. "I did," she admitted after a moment, her voice soft. "At first. I won't lie to you, David. I missed the way he made me feel. At least at the beginning." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "And now?" I pressed, my voice barely more than a whisper. She shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No," she said firmly. "Not anymore." I realized now that it wasn't about him, not really. It was about me, about how I felt, lost, invisible. I was looking for something I thought I'd lost with you. I nodded, feeling a small flicker of relief. "And do you think we can find it again?" I asked, my voice steady. She reached out, taking my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "I think we already are," she whispered, her eyes filled with a sincerity I hadn't seen in a long time. "I want to try, David. I really do. I want us to work." I felt something shift inside me, a weight lifting just a little. It wasn't a perfect answer, wasn't the clean resolution I had hoped for, but it was honest. It was real. And that was something. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Slowly, tentatively, we started to rebuild. We went on walks, took trips together, talked late into the night like we used to. I still felt the sting of betrayal sometimes, still heard Jake's words echo in my mind, but I was learning to push them aside, to focus on the here and now, on the woman sitting beside me, holding my hand. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger flared up again, days when the hurt felt too raw, too deep. But each time, we came back to the same thing. We were trying. Both of us, trying to rebuild, to make sense of the mess we had made, to find a way forward. One night, as we sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily turned to me, her expression serious. "David," she said softly, "I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken something between us. But I want you to know, I'm committed to us, to fixing this. I don't know if we'll ever be the same, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to find out. Are you?" I looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, the earnestness in her words. I felt the pain still lingering, The betrayal still fresh, but I also felt something else. Love, buried beneath all the hurt, but still there, still beating. I am, I replied, my voice steady. I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes. She smiled then, a small, hopeful smile, and I felt something inside me soften. I knew we weren't fixed. I knew we had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. We sat there in the quiet, the stars beginning to dot the sky, and I felt her hand tighten around mine. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if we would make it through. But I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. And as I looked at her, I saw that she wasn't either. Maybe that was enough, at least for now.